Democratic Congresswoman Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez once said, "The best part about playing video games is the lore. Literally the only reason that you should be playing a video game is if you want to experience its world building." Now, I hate to get political on this channel, but I 100% agree with this statement, which is why I decided to give the new Hyrule Warriors game a chance. Also, think about it. AOC, Age of Calamity, huh? Anyway, the point is that I was genuinely excited for this game to come out. I've never been a huge fan of these Dynasty Warriors crossover games, but if there was ever going to be one that worked, Age of Calamity was it. The idea of a Dynasty Warriors style game happening during the calamity that took place 100 years before the events of Breath of the Wild makes perfect sense. All the big set pieces that you need are already built in by virtue of the divine beasts, and fighting through hordes of evil minions is a staple of the Warriors franchise. Breath of the Wild had pretty tenuous lore as a result of its minimalist storytelling, so there was a lot of room for imagination in terms of making the story for this game. I went into this with the full knowledge that the Warriors style of games have notoriously shallow gameplay, so I put most of my expectations on the narrative. Those expectations were that they'll flesh out the lore a little bit, they'll probably make a concrete reason for why Ganon is returning, and they'll set up for the beginning of Breath of the Wild because this is a prequel to Breath of the Wild, right?
I think you are now ready. Ready to hear what happened 100 years ago.
Well, no. Apparently my expectations were way too high for this game because despite how much Nintendo is pushing it, and despite how much their corporate game review cronies are selling it as some love letter to Breath of the Wild, this is just another installment in a long line of shitty spin-off games that don't even deserve to be mentioned in the same breath as their source material. Yeah, strap in, cause this review ain't gonna be pretty. Let me concede on one point, okay? Hyrule Warriors Age of Calamity is comparable to many of the mainline Zelda games in one very specific way. It wants to appropriate all of the visual design, story beats, and musical motifs of its predecessor without actually being held accountable to a linear timeline or coherent narrative progression.
Legend of Zelda Monopoly!
I would not consider this to be a major problem for the mainline series of Zelda games because at the end of the day, when you're playing them, you're not thinking about whether or not those other games are even canon. Age of Calamity will never let you forget that Breath of the Wild happened. The game is cobbled together by mounds of fan service and all of the worst Skyward Sword era Zelda plot contrivances. What makes that so terrible is that the writers so obviously could not give less of a fuck about maintaining a consistent lore between the two games. You wanna know how I know that? It's because Hyrule Warriors exists in some weird alternate time dimension from Breath of the Wild. That's right, there's time travel. Is it horrible? Yes. Is it ever explained? No. Does the game even make fun of how horrible it is? Yes. Do I by and large hate all time travel narratives? No, but I think it's extremely hard to pull off, and if it's not done right, it just winds up looking lazy and cliche and boring. To be abundantly clear, that is exactly what the narrative to this game is, and it doesn't make it any less horrible when you acknowledge how horrible it is.
None of this makes any sense.
There are so many playable characters that have zero reason for existing at all. I mean, I don't even remember who Yunobo was. And to be honest, I still kinda don't. He's basically just Morty, but played straight.
You're not going to like this!
Oh man, it's the character everyone's been waiting for! Monk Mozzarella! And the Great Fairies too? Damn! I hope they don't have the most bass-ackwards moveset in the whole game! Alright, let's bring it back down to earth for a second. Now, the reason why so many playable characters stings a little bit is because, now stay with me for a second, I think that Hyrule Warriors Age of Calamity actually has a more consistent combat system than Breath of the Wild. Oh, I can't believe I just said that. But it's true. I mean, the activation window for Flurry Rush is a lot less generous than the one in Breath of the Wild, but that inadvertently takes away a lot of the guesswork. Before going any further, we need to talk about the two different enemy types in Age of Calamity. First are the grunt monsters, which don't have health bars, you can't lock onto them, and they're very rarely a threat to your safety. Then you have the large monsters, which consist of everything from your basic moblin all the way up to the final boss of the game. They do have health bars, you can lock onto them, and more often than not you're encouraged to use one of your special abilities to beat them. Each character's moveset is pretty complex. I mean, it's not Neo levels of complexity or anything, but it's no slouch either. Each character has 4 Sheikah Slate abilities, 3 wand abilities, a regular attack tree that only looks complicated, and a unique ability that can sometimes change how the attack tree works. Link is the only one, spoiler alert besides Zelda, who can use multiple weapon types. In my personal opinion, two-handed weapons and spears feel a lot worse to play than one-handed weapons, and you get the Master Sword pretty early on in the story too, so once you get that, why would you really even need to use anything else? It's not like any of your weapons break, which by the way completely obliterates any need to have an inventory limitation on how many weapons you can carry. But I'm getting way ahead of myself. I was talking about combat, right? There is a moderate amount of complexity to this combat system, but that doesn't necessarily translate to enjoyability. Case in point, the literal millions of fodder enemies that you'll fight on your course through the game. There are only 2 possible objectives that you could have while you're fighting these guys. Either you're trying to wipe out as many as possible, or you're trying to run through them to get to a different location. Neither of these objectives require anything other than your standard attacks to complete efficiently. This winds up giving you potato chip brain. God, I love this analogy. When you keep fighting these fodder monsters over and over again, you'll eventually find an attack combo that efficiently wipes out a bunch of them at once. The combos are super flashy and feel good enough to pull off that your brain is stimulated for a second, just enough to make you want to come back for more. It's like eating potato chips, it's addictive by nature. They're designed to keep you reaching for more even if you don't really want to. Now there's nothing inherently wrong with this. There are plenty of potato chip games that I enjoy. I think it becomes a problem when it's overutilized or the context for it, aka the story, is not engaging enough. Or in the case of Hyrule Warriors, both. So that only applies to the fodder monsters, which, like it or not, is a huge selling point for the Warriors series as a whole. But there is another side to the combat system that I haven't talked about yet, and that's the one-on-one duels with the larger monsters. I was pleasantly surprised by this aspect of the combat system, but you should take it with a grain of salt because this is an RPG after all, which means that you can number tweak your way into invincibility. I just so happened to have a playstyle that put me in a nice number range to have some compelling and pretty intense duels. Not all of them were fantastic, I mean most of them were pretty rinse and repeat, but especially the duels with the Thunderblade and Windblade and the Blight Ganons, I guess, those were pretty awesome. Approaching them in the optional challenges outside of the main story was by far the most fun I had during the gameplay, and it was the most engaged I was during my whole playthrough. During these boss fights, you're encouraged to use all of the tools in your arsenal to push your advantage state as far as it'll go. It's genuinely engaging to see how many hits you can get in before you have to dodge out or go for a flurry rush. It's not all sunshine and rainbows though, this game is definitely a BHB. It's a bad habit builder. This game teaches young gamers everywhere how to mash, which is the single worst bad habit that you could have when you're playing an action RPG. Mashing when prompted is fine, but if you feel like you're doing every single attack and you're mashing the entire time, there's a problem there. Mashing starts to happen when your attacks don't feel weighty enough to deserve their own button press. Either they're just bouncing off the enemy, or they're not causing enough damage, possibly both. It could happen when attacks are slow, but there are some counterexamples to that. In retrospect, how can we even really blame video game reviewers for being bad at video games when they have to play 13 BHBs a year? Easy, they prop up dog shit pandering fanbait like this. Okay, playing as the Divine Beast is not the worst thing in the world, but you definitely need to turn off motion controls for that shit to be even remotely playable. It's cool and fun to an extent, but then it's just completely undercut by sequences like this. Like, come on bro, are you fucking serious with this shit? Yeah, love letter to Breath of the Wild by the way. Shamelessly rips off gameplay elements that aren't even compatible with the core gameplay, also completely disregards the personal sacrifices that made Breath of the Wild's barebones story so emotionally impactful.
I left them all to die.
I even got to see the face behind the champion.
Really fleshes out the lore of the Zelda cinematic universe. Look, I don't want to be the stock negative Andy over here, okay? If you're a die-hard Zelda fan, like ride or die for Skyward Sword even, or this game seems like it's right up your alley, then by all means have at it. But you won't catch me dead praising the shoddily constructed narrative, or the caked on layers of fan service, or the copy and paste action RPG that is Hyrule Warriors Age of Calamity.